They took your clothes first, folded them away, tagged them, stored them like evidence you might need to reclaim one day, though most never did. Then came the uniform, coarse, ill-fitting, the same rough weave as everyone else's, so that from across a courtyard you were indistinguishable from 100 other broken circumstances. Then came your number, not your name, your number, chalked on a slate or stitched into fabric, because a name implies a person, and the institution had already stopped thinking of you as one. And before an hour had passed inside that building, they had already taken your children out of your arms and led them through a different door. You are entering a Victorian workhouse, and what happens next will teach you exactly what this country thought poverty was worth. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a system built to help the poor was actually engineered to punish them, and why that machinery still echoes in how we talk about poverty today. Let's start with the door itself, because the moment you walked through it, you stopped being a family and became 3 separate inmates. Men in one wing, women in another, children in a third, and depending on the institution, split further still by age, infants from toddlers, toddlers from adolescents. Many union workhouses were built to a deliberate cruciform or radial design, wings splayed out from a central hub, specifically so that the sexes and age groups could be kept apart at every hour of the day. You might catch a glimpse of your husband across a courtyard during exercise hour, at a strictly regulated distance, under supervision. You might not be allowed to speak to him even then. Elderly couples who had been married 40 years, 50 years, could be separated the same as anyone else, a detail that later became one of the loudest public objections to the system, precisely because it was so visibly, needlessly cruel to people who posed no threat to anyone. This wasn't an accident of overcrowded architecture. It was policy. The poor law framework that governed workhouses across England drew on ideas about vagrancy and dependency that stretched back centuries, as far back as the Statute of Cambridge in 1388, which first tried to legally restrict the movement of the poor. But the system you're standing inside now took shape after 1815, when the end of the Napoleonic Wars flooded the country with unemployed men, and parishes panicked over how to manage or contain the sudden surge of destitution. That panic hardened into law with the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which forced parishes into unions, built the workhouses you're standing in, and made relief outside the workhouse walls deliberately harder to get than relief inside them. That separation wasn't a bureaucratic accident, and here's the question worth sitting with. Why would a system designed to help the poor want to tear their families apart before doing anything else? Because you probably walked into this video with an assumption that the workhouse was basically Victorian welfare. Grim, sure, brutal even, but at least a safety net, a roof, a meal, better than starving in the street. That assumption is wrong, and the historical record is blunt about why. The workhouse wasn't designed to relieve poverty. It was designed to deter it. The men who drafted the 1834 reforms, commissioners like Edwin Chadwick, economists like Nassau Sr., spoke openly about a principle called less eligibility, the idea that conditions inside the workhouse had to be worse than the worst conditions available outside it, worse than the lowest paid, most exploitative job in the parish. That way, no one would enter unless they had absolutely no other choice left. In a culture that treated poverty as a moral failure, laziness, drunkenness, weak character, the workhouse existed to punish destitution, not cure it. It was engineered fear, built out of brick and slate roofing, and it worked exactly as intended. So what did that fear actually feel like once you were inside, with nowhere left to go? Hunger, mostly. Constant, low-grade, deliberate hunger. Meals were monotonous by design. Gruel thin enough to see the bottom of the bowl through. Bread, broth, meat rationed so thin it barely counted as meat at all. The food was calculated to keep a body alive and working, not comfortable, not full. Historians studying workhouse dietary tables have found meal plans calibrated almost mathematically. Enough calories to labor, never enough to feel satisfied, adjusted by age and sex down to the ounce. Your day ran on a rigid timetable, a bell to wake you before dawn, a bell to work you, a bell to feed you in silence at long communal tables, a bell to lock you down for the night. You broke stones in an open yard until your palms blistered and split. You picked oakum, tearing apart old tarred rope fibers strand by strand until your fingers cracked and bled into the pile you were supposed to hand over by weight. You scrubbed floors, hauled water, sorted rags, over and over, in exchange for the same gruel you'd eaten the day before, and the day before that. The labor wasn't there to teach you a trade. It was there to make sure the institution never once felt like a reward for being poor. But starvation and labor were only half the machine. There was a second weapon, aimed at something harder to break than the stomach. Shame. That was the real currency of the workhouse. Even the word used for you, inmate, wasn't neutral. It was the same word used for prisoners, deliberately blurring the line between poverty and crime in the public imagination. Being seen walking toward a workhouse gate could mark a family for years. Neighbors remembered. Employers remembered. Children carried the stigma of the workhouse boy or the workhouse girl long after they'd left the building behind, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Die inside those walls with no family able to claim you, and even your death carried the mark. Pauper burials were cheap, unmarked, sometimes shared. And under the Anatomy Act of 1832, unclaimed workhouse bodies could legally be handed over to medical schools for dissection, a fate the poor understood and dreaded, specifically because it stripped away the last dignity available to anyone else. And the truly brutal genius of the system was this: it didn't even need you inside to work. Just the existence of the workhouse, just the dread of it, was often enough to pressure desperate people into accepting starvation wages, unsafe work, exploitative landlords, anything at all, rather than risk those gates. The threat did as much labor as the walls. So who actually ended up inside when the outside world had failed them completely? Not just the unemployed, the elderly who'd outlived their savings and their families, the sick, too weak to labor and too poor to be treated elsewhere, orphans, widows, the physically disabled, unmarried mothers cast out by their own communities and treated under the poor law's bastardy clauses as morally suspect on top of destitute. Anyone the parish decided had exhausted every other option got funneled into the same punitive system, regardless of how they'd arrived at poverty in the first place. Children born inside sometimes grew up almost entirely within its walls, educated in workhouse schools, put to labor young, separated from whatever parent they had left for the length of their stay. And there was no real exit built into the design. The labor you performed sustained the institution, its laundry, its farm plots, its workshops, but it wasn't structured to lift you out of poverty. It simply processed you, day after day, until either work outside became available or you didn't need help anymore, for whatever reason that turned out to be. And when the system failed even by its own harsh standards, it failed loudly. In 1845 and 1846, an official inquiry exposed conditions at the Andover Workhouse in Hampshire, where inmates set to crushing old animal bones for fertilizer were found so starved they were gnawing the marrow and gristle from those same bones before grinding them down. It became a national scandal, debated in Parliament precisely because it revealed what the whole system was quietly capable of producing when deterrence was allowed to run unchecked. Andover wasn't the design working perfectly. It was the design working exactly as far as no one had bothered to stop it. This isn't just a grim historical footnote, filed away with powdered wigs and gas lamps. If this system unsettled you, the next thing worth understanding is how similar deterrent thinking shaped debt prisons and workhouse-adjacent institutions across the Atlantic, because the logic didn't stay contained to one country or one century. The workhouse formalized something that already existed in English culture long before the first poor law was written: the belief that poverty is a personal failing, something to be corrected through suffering rather than a circumstance to be relieved. That belief didn't die with the last workhouse closures in the early 20th century. It shows up every time a debate about welfare turns into a debate about who deserves it. Every time hardship gets treated as something to prove rather than something to solve. Historians tracing the poor law era can draw a fairly direct line from that Victorian machinery straight into modern instincts about deservingness. The idea that help should come with suffering attached, or it doesn't count as earned. So the next time you catch yourself thinking someone struggling financially just needs to try harder, or deserves less help than they're asking for, pause on that thought before it finishes forming. That instinct wasn't always yours. It was built, brick by brick, in institutions exactly like this one, and it outlived every building it was ever housed in. You inherited that reflex secondhand. You don't have to keep it. This wasn't fiction. This was somebody's whole life.